He's Dean of the LKY New School of Public Policy at NUS. He obtained his Bachelor of Arts in Economics degree from Princeton University in 1980 and a PhD in Economics from the Harvard University in 1986. He's not as young as he looks. And listen to this. He's got a Taekwondo third Dan black belt, and he has taken part in international competitions in the UK and so on. So quite a formidable character. Danny Quah, welcome to Inconvenient Questions.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
It's a great pleasure to have you. So let's hunker down to the issue that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about something that usually becomes very talked about during this season, called the general election season, right? The issue of inequality. And I'm sure this will be one of the key issues that will come up during the hustings of the election, right? And it is not only Singapore. It is a popular idea all over the world. The UNDP, United Nations Development Program, United Nations, President Obama, various other presidents, even the Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum. I mean, they all talk about this. Inequality is the bad guy. Inequality is the root of all evil in the world. That's how, and you call it the grand narrative in your article. You know, you call it the grand narrative. And if I may quote you, you said, it's a grand narrative of inequality driving political upheaval has emerged even when in reality, the situation of poor and underclass improve. So you actually are presenting an argument that could be viewed as being heretical by a lot of people in the world, because your argument is essentially that inequality is not the bad guy that we should be going after.
I completely agree with you on this grand narrative that has emerged around the world. As you say, this will be very much a part of the Singapore conversation going forward. But in addition, individuals from all over the world, the Pope, as you say, tweeted, inequality is the root of all social evil. President Barack Obama, in the last few years when he was in the White House, described inequality as the defining challenge of our time. And many writers and observers have connected inequality with the emergence of nationalist populism, tensions between nations, practically going into class warfare, antagonisms between rich and poor. As you say, my view is one that says, hold on a minute. Have we got the right culprit? Is it really inequality that's to blame for all of these social ills? So very quickly, let me say, I firmly believe that people need jobs and incomes. People need jobs as part of human dignity. People need incomes and opportunities to continue to advance in life. It should be the case that even those with humble beginnings see a pathway for how they can improve their set of circumstances. All of that, I am in agreement. The question is inequality to blame for confounding the possibility of all of these things? And maybe the way to begin is, let's imagine an earlier time when many people were indeed poor. Their circumstances were such that they were barely scratching the earth to get by. But here's the thing. Everybody around them was equally poor. Right? That is a situation where, surprise, there is no inequality. But life was a horrible proposition. People did not have any control over their own destiny.
I was just casting my mind back to the 1960s and 70s when I was growing up. Right? You're right. Everybody around me was poor. I mean, I remember going to RI secondary school. Almost 95% of us were poor. Right?
Exactly.
And so we didn't feel particularly poor, if you know what I mean. Although we were really poor, we couldn't afford a lot of things. But today, fast forward today, we have access to a lot of things. I mean, the same people who started off poor, we have access to a lot of things. Our incomes have gone up. Income has gone up. We can, but there are always people above us who are so much richer.
Mm.
We didn't experience that in the 1960s and 70s. There were very few people who were very rich and driving in expensive cars, for example.
Mm, mm. Well, it's a hazard of the human condition, what you've described, that many of us have feelings of envy. We are envious of those who are better off than us. And those feelings are valid. No one denies
and natural
and valid and natural, and we need to use that productively, creatively, to advance ourselves. But that is quite different from saying that inequality is the problem. In a way, envy has been layered on top of inequality. And so there are multiple ways in which we need to deal with this. But let me, if I may, give you another example of inequality in the real world, as you say. America. America is a society where inequality has risen to historical heights. Okay. It is a society where inequality is so steep that has become a political football by which national populist leaders can leverage their success in elections. Over the last 40 years.
Quick question, just so that our viewers understand. What's your definition of inequality, income inequality?
Disparity between rich and poor. That's the only thing we need, the gap between rich and poor.
Okay.
In technical discussions, there's often different concepts of indexes and all the rest of it. Those aren't relevant for our discussion. Simply the gap between rich and poor. So let's pick up on that point, Vishwas. What is the gap between rich and poor in the United States? Even more interesting than that gap is its dynamics. How has it changed? So over the last 4 decades in the United States, the average income in the top 10%, the very rich, that has risen threefold. That's the rich. The average income of the bottom 50%, the middle class and down, that has fallen. It has not risen. The world's most powerful economy, most dynamic society, has seen 4 decades where the bottom 50% have seen no improvement in economic circumstances. A terrible situation for society to be in, high and rising inequality. Let's put that to one side. Let's look at another society, which is even worse, China. Over the same 4 decades, the top 10% in China have seen their incomes rise tenfold. America, threefold.
Compared to threefold.
China, tenfold. So many more times than the United States. Inequality in China, the gap between rich and poor, is higher than it's ever been. But here's the thing. The bottom 50% in China have seen their incomes rise fourfold. In other words, even though inequality in China has reached unprecedented heights, it's growing at a clip faster than even the United States, the poor in China are seeing their incomes rise faster than the rich in America are seeing their incomes rise. That's a very stark difference between what's happening to inequality and what should be our concern, the plight of the vulnerable in society. Yeah. Our society is taking care of their weak and vulnerable.
Yeah. So if I could just ask you,
please,
just to understand. So what you're saying is there could be a very wide gap between the rich and the poor. There could be a very wide gap. But that doesn't necessarily have a bearing on whether there is income mobility. Income mobility is one's ability to move up the ranks, move up socially, correct?
Absolutely.
Isn't that what you're saying?
Absolutely. There's a fragmentation, a split between those two concepts, high rising inequality, income mobility. And I'm glad you raised that point because I told you the story about America and China. Are they extreme examples that I've just picked out? Well, they are. I've picked them out to make the point. But here's the other fact about the world. In 80%, 4/5 of the cases in the last 4 decades where inequality has risen, so has income mobility. So have incomes at the bottom 50%. In fact, in other words, China's story is the story of the world. America's story about inequality is so extreme in the other direction, we need to stop thinking that America is the norm.
The subprime crisis in the USA, right?
The subprime crisis in the USA.
In the US, 2008, right, or 2009. The subprime crisis in the USA, that's presented as an example of the risk of barking up the wrong tree in finding a solution.
Absolutely.
Am I correct?
Absolutely.
Could you elaborate on that?
There is a narrative that some economists are investigating that says, why did the US subprime mortgage crisis happen? Why was there such a bubble in the US housing market? And some of these writers have traced it to a well-meaning political measure that was designed to help the poor. Okay, so this policy measure, which emerged from the White House, encouraged greater and greater lending to households that had low income and low assets, because that was thought to be a good way to treat the symptom of inequality, helping the poor rise, but without actually dealing with fundamental causes. The end result of that is that house prices were overinflated. Poor people who could not afford rich houses bought them at basically putting 0% down. And when interest rates moved in the wrong direction, all of the structure collapsed. And it collapsed not just, very unfortunately, on America's poor, its impact was felt throughout the world. Widows and orphans who had bought all over the world, Norway, Singapore, Hong Kong, who had bought into US housing market and financial institutions, all suffered. Getting wrong a policy on appropriate treatment of inequality is hugely dangerous. Now, having said all that, let me reflect a bit on what you've described as what's happening in the political conversation here.
Yeah.
It is a good, appropriate story here because it has always, in Singapore, been about helping the disadvantaged rise in society through providing employment subsidies, through protecting wage, through increasing wages, wage subsidies, improving education, increasing standards in schools. All of this give a pathway to treat the fundamental cause of the poor being poor. It opens up opportunities for income mobility. This is exactly the right way to be dealing with the problem, the challenge of inequality.
Haven't we been, I agree with you, including the transfers, right? The budget transfers. But haven't we also been dealing with the issue that for a very long time, the income of the bottom 20-25% of Singapore has been depressed? The wages and the income generally has been depressed. So that goes back to your argument, right? That that would have had an effect on mobility.
To the extent that that is accurate, I mean, it comes from the interaction of many different sectors of the economy. There are some sectors, low wage construction work, for instance, the 3D jobs,
right.
Dirty, dangerous, demeaning jobs,
for
whom wages have been trapped. But it is not something, it is a challenge that is well recognized in the policy community. And I think the solution that's being put forward is also the right one. The reason wages are low in those industries is because productivity is low. The way to raise wages in those industries is to raise productivity, to invest in capital, to upskill people, to put machines to work. By raising productivity, automatically wages will start to rise. The problem is we're stuck in what economists think of as a self-fulfilling, low-level equilibrium trap.
Yeah.
Because wages are low, there's no incentive to improve productivity. Because productivity is not improved, wages cannot rise. So the right policy solution here is to continue, as the government is already doing, to nudge for productivity improvements in the low-wage sectors of the economy.
So would you say, Danny, sorry, would you say therefore that the much touted Gini coefficient, is not necessarily an accurate estimate or indication of a sense of well-being of society?
I agree. I think that the Gini coefficient was designed with certain things in mind for which it served its purpose, but it's past its sell-by date in a world that's dynamically changing, where we need to be concerned about mobility, fairness, upskilling and reskilling, the impact of the fourth industrial revolution. All of these things make the notion of a static view of inequality problematic.
Yeah, we have just about a minute left. So I need to ask you this question. You've brought up something that's very interesting and very relevant to Singapore. But all that is calculus. You're looking at numbers, you're looking at statistics and so on, and makes a lot of sense from that point of view. But the human being is a ball of emotion at the end of the day, right? We are affected by a sense of being left behind. Notional or otherwise, we are affected by a sense of not being treated fairly in society. There is envy. Envy is not a bad thing. Envy happens, it's a natural thing, So how do you balance your theory, or your understanding of the problem with the notional views of a sense of that affects one's sense of well-being in the end?
Thank you. Those feelings that you described are all valid ones. They're genuine and they present a social challenge. What we need to do is to think about how, as society, as government, as elements of society, we rebuild a new social compact, one that acknowledges all the different segments of society that all need to work together and all need to raise each other, because it is by helping one another that we help ourselves. It's by raising those around us that we lift ourselves. And this new social compact is one that's very much at odds with how a lot of other societies are going. We need to be thinking about those kinds of social compact ideas and having a conversation about them in the society that we're in.
If there's one specific thing that you'd like to see change in the way we design our social compact, what would that be, Danny?
I think that our emphasis on education is the right one. We're making it inclusive, and I think pushing us along in that journey will be hugely gainful to building this new social compact.
And perhaps starting with not having such a strong differentiation between white and blue collar jobs.
So. Right. Absolutely.
And maybe that's also the reason why economics is usually in the arts faculty and not science. Thank you very much, Danny, for joining us in Inconvenient Questions. Thank you.